One fateful day, two friends found a gateway into a realm of dreams. A place beyond time, beyond space, beyond that which is known to man. Here lies infinity, a portal into the imagination and the supernatural. Amidst the eerie, the bizarre, the strangely unsettling, the girls felt right at home. And so they welcome you to this realm of shadow and substance. Keep your imagination alight and take a step, dear listener, into the fifth dimension.
Hello to our listeners and welcome to the fifth dimension where we're talking about episodes from the Twilight Zone. You have two hosts for your podcast. My name is Parvati Ramkumar and with me is my co-host Medhavi.
Hi.
So today, Medhavi, we're discussing One for the Angels, right? It's one of those unusually heartwarming episodes that is quite exciting.
Absolutely.
So basically, today's episode, let me try to give a very short summary. So basically, today's episode is about a sidewalk pitchman who calls himself Lou Bookman. He's an elderly man about 69 years old and he sells various trinkets on the sidewalk and he's a fixture on a sidewalk. What he does is he sometimes gives free things to the children in the neighborhood, and it seems to me that it's a slightly ramshackle neighborhood, so the children are very thrilled with those gifts. One day, Mr. Bookman goes back home and he finds a very unusual visitor in his house, a supernatural visitor who says to him that it is time and he has to leave at midnight. And Mr. Bookman, putting two and two together, decides to do a very dramatic thing and attempt to trick this individual, this supernatural individual, and then things don't go very well for him because a child is supposed to be taken in his place. And eventually what happens is Mr. Bookman has to undo the damage he has done to save another life. What do you think about this episode, Medhavi?
It was an absolutely fascinating episode. I mean, to begin with, the opening narration, right from the opening narration until the very end, I was just hooked onto it. It was such an interesting story. And like you said, unexpectedly heartwarming. It did have those strange and supernatural elements to it, but none of that really got us scared. But it was definitely a very, very compelling tale and a very well executed one.
Absolutely. If we were to use a spookometer, how would this episode rate?
The spookometer, I would say this would land a solid 2 on the spookometer. It wasn't particularly spooky, and I guess we'll come to that towards maybe in our spoiler section. But the figure of specific supernatural figure whom one encounters, he's not very scary at all, and I think that's the whole point. Like that's what makes the story so compelling, because this creature who is supposed to be extremely scary is presented as a very run-of-the-mill character, which is what I found so fascinating and interesting. I loved that.
Absolutely. I too think, on the spookometer, this episode would rate pretty low, maybe 1 or 2. And there were some really tense moments, but I wasn't scared. I mean, I was sometimes, wondering where things are going, but I would definitely not say that I was scary. It's still a great episode though, even if it isn't scary.
Undoubtedly, I swear. I would say genre-wise, this would fall more into drama or like a dramedy than, a horror or supernatural or sci-fi episode, which is the usual case with these things. What do you think?
I think so. I think, there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of emotion, and there's some psychological trickery as Lou Bookman attempts to do this and that to gain an extension in quotation marks.
Yeah.
And he does do something that he thinks is very clever, but he must pay the price for being too clever by half. And I thought that was such a brilliant twist. I enjoyed it so much, even though there were times when I felt sad because people who don't deserve certain circumstances are forced into certain circumstances because of Lou Bookman and his ultra intelligent thinking. And the supernatural creature, like you said, is he's not scary. He's actually pretty dashing and well spoken.
Absolutely. Quite charming, I must say. Quite charming. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I think a lot of those parts could even be funny, like the parts which would otherwise appear very scary in way. Those parts would appear quite scary, but with this script, it's quite amusing and almost comedic in certain parts.
It's definitely comedic, and I love how dramatic Lou Bookman is as he's thinking of things to say,
Oh
and
yeah,
he's constantly trying to think of ways to be as clever as he thinks he is, which isn't very clever, as we see later. He's really,
absolutely.
I think the only person who was completely outwitted was himself in the end.
True, very true. Yeah, but that was very interesting. So we could maybe move into the spoiler section now and
Yeah,
discuss some of our favorite bits from the episode.
absolutely. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, so I think, like I said, the very first thing that I absolutely loved is the narration in the very beginning. It frames the entire story so wonderfully,
Hmm.
and it gives it that, that one sentence that he would be visited by death
Oh,
this
yes.
afternoon. That was so. I think that was the most arrest. Like that is what captured the attention so well. And if I were to peg something as somewhat supernatural or somewhat
Hmm.
startling, that would be
Ah,
it. Like that one sentence, it was the most startling and interesting thing. And of
it's,
course, from there it builds up. But that was wonderful. Yeah. And of course, I loved the conversations between Lou Bookman and Death. I mean, they
oh,
were
yes.
both so charismatic in their own way. I think we talked about this, right? When we were watching the
Ah,
episode together, we
yeah.
talked about how if Death were that charming, I would go willingly,
Yeah,
willingly
that
walk
would
into.
it would be very easy for him, just ask.
Yeah, exactly. So I loved that. I loved how
Ah,
both of the characters were, I loved the characterization of, and I loved the twists, like you said, the twists just kept
mm,
coming and coming, and it was great. I think at a very basic level, it's a very simple story, right? It's not
yeah,
like
yeah.
something extremely dramatic happens, but it's done so well. It's told
Mm,
so well by both the actors and the makers of the show that it just falls into place so perfectly. How about
I
you,
agree.
Parvati?
I found it so beautifully made. And when you talk about the narration in the beginning, like you said, and the narration at the beginning talks about death and talks about how Lou Bookman is going to have this encounter with death. His time is up. You wouldn't expect Death to be dressed in a suit and to sit so elegantly in a chair and speak so eloquently. You wouldn't expect any of that. He is actually so unassuming that Lou Bookman doesn't believe he's Death until quite a bit later. Death never tells Lou Bookman that you are going to die. He just says, it's time, it's time, it's time. And Lou Bookman
Yeah,
is slow on the uptake with that. And
exactly.
those interactions were so amazing. There was a point where I thought it was a little bit unnerving, and that's where Maggie comes in, the little girl who lives in Lou Bookman's building. She comes in to meet Lou Bookman. She wants to talk to him, and then she can't see Death at that time because it's not her
Yeah,
time yet. And Lou Bookman keeps pointing to Death and saying, "There's a man sitting in the corner. He's sitting on the chair, and Maggie can't see him, and it's all very confusing for him." And then, as Mr. Bookman keeps going on, and he tricks Death by saying he wants to make that one pitch. When he made
yes,
he said he wants to make that one sales pitch that will give him a break, and then he's ready to die, and to please give him an extension. And I thought he's going to twist that somehow, and he's going to try and trick
yeah.
Death. Things are not going to go well for
That's
him.
not gonna go well. That's not gonna go well.
That's not going to go well. And Death is so considerate in granting him that extension, and then he realized he's been duped.
I love how much death is humanized in this
Yes,
scheme of things. Like
exactly.
first of all, death is just it's like a government worker. He
Exactly.
says, right, that have you come from the people who conduct the census? Yeah, that's exactly the way death is functioning, right? Like as a clerk or as just a government worker who's maintaining his records and getting things
Yeah.
done, and just has a fixed time. He has appointments. He's wearing a business suit, and it's just so
He's got a
interesting.
note.
And then, of course, in his conduct also, and in the way that he just pities, like he sympathizes or
Yes.
with Lou Bookman and gives him that extension. And he's absolutely humanized, and I love that. That was very interesting.
That one portion where he was shown to be not human is where he says he must make alternate arrangements. And then you realize that he's not as human as he seems. He's very considerate. He can be compassionate, but he's still death. Now, if you're going
Yeah.
to try and dupe him, he's not going to take to it kindly. And his choice
Yeah.
was actually Maggie, which is really tragic. Instead of Bookman, he chooses a little girl, and he knows that Mr. Bookman is very close to Maggie because Bookman gives her gifts and he keeps her happy. And having her as an alternate choice was really, really unfortunate. I felt sad when she was hit by the car.
Exactly.
She didn't die immediately, but you know that until Lou Bookman comes up with something really, really unusual or something really brilliant, she's going to die.
She's going to die. Precisely. I think that is where Death, like you said, loses his heart, right? And for
Yes.
him, taking somebody's life is just a routine thing. It's something that is the treasury of his existence. That okay, yeah, he has to do it. But we see how, I guess, how important this idea of life and death is to humans. That is
Yep.
not the case death. For death, it's just
Yeah.
a routine procedure.
That's his only job. I feel, like you said, he has been humanized, able to feel. And Lou Bookman, I don't know why he thought it was a good idea to try and take advantage of that. I'm not sure at all. When you do something like this, you have to think the consequences. And Lou Bookman and Mr. Bookman just, I don't know, it went over his head in his desperation to be clever.
He has to too clever by half. That really cost him. And one part this episode that I really, really enjoyed, Medhavi, is that part where he had to make that one ultimate pitch that he was talking about. In the beginning, he thought he could just say, I need to make this big sales pitch and then I'll be ready to die. And he had no plans of making it. But when Maggie was hit by the car, he had to make that sales pitch to death.
And I loved that idea of the last pitch being something that doesn't benefit him in any way, but it saves a life. That was very interesting. And in that sense, I don't know why it reminded me of O. Henry's The Last Leaf.
The leaf was painted on, and the person who thought she would die, and then she saw the leaf.
Absolutely.
It's a lot like
And
that.
there again, it is about that other artists, the old artist's masterpiece. Like that is the concern. Even here, this is the pitch of a lifetime for Lou Book.
I think, his foolishness led to this one thing that should not have happened, and he was forced to bring out the actual genius within as a last act, exactly like The Last Leaf. It was a poignant moment, and I loved how he had Death mesmerized with his sales pitch.
He was so effective, and like that was his best. Again, like there again, Death was humanized in a way that Lou Bookman was absolutely able to capture his attention, so much so that he missed his appointment. And
Yes.
that goes to show how fantastic Lou Bookman was in that desperate attempt to save Maggie's life.
Exactly. And he was selling such silly things to Death and like thread,
Yeah.
shoelaces and thread and some silly, very silly things. And Death was listening to him as though he's enthralled and enchanted and ensconcelled and whatever other synonym we can think of.
Those things were absolutely useless to Death. And that is exactly what salesmen do, right? And that's exactly
Yeah.
like he was the perfect salesman in that sense because he sold Death something that was absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah, absolutely unnecessary, useless things he sold Death, and Death bought all of it in a bag, which was amazing.
Death was like, come at me.
Because he missed that 12 o'clock appointment with Maggie because of Lou Bookman. But Lou Bookman managed to rectify it because he said, take me instead. He's a good manservant. And that was also a sales pitch.
That was also so interesting, that take me instead. Like that was a different way of saying take me instead.
He said he
Different and
eats
far more convincing.
a lot more convincing because as a manservant, he says he eats little, he sleeps little, he works very hard, he's got so many talents. At first, Death had no idea what he was referring to. He was blank. And then when he caught on, by the time he caught on, it was past midnight and Maggie had started recovering. That was also a way of humanizing Death because despite his somewhat cold, supernatural nature, he can still miss appointments and allow people to live because he's caught in a sales pitch.
Absolutely. And he is sold. He like at the end of it, he's sold. So he says that, yeah, I missed that appointment now and it's time for you to come with me.
He's so calm. half smiling, and he doesn't
Yeah.
mind really because he got a soul anyway. He got the
Yeah.
original soul he had come for. He's done well. He feels he's done well, and he's happy about it. So that was fun to watch, and also really sad when the closing narration says Lou Bookman was important to the children, and therefore he was an important man. He may not have
Yeah.
made much of an impact on other people, maybe not on the adults, and I'm not sure how much he sold while he was alive, all of those things that he was trying to sell. He may not have sold much of it looking at his living circumstances and the way he was, but he was a happy man who kept children happy.
Absolutely. The beginning and the ending narration just brings it together so beautifully. I just love that. And
Absolutely.
his last act was dedicated to the children that he loved.
He wanted to keep them safe somehow, anyhow, just keep them safe. And he's
Yeah.
also so confident in his sales pitches that he decides to take all his stuff with him up there as he goes with death so that he can
Yeah.
sell it to whom? Maybe he can sell it to the angels. I don't know.
Like you said, you never know who might
Yeah.
need something there.
Up there. And Death is quite charming about the whole thing. He says, yes, you made it. He made it up there. It was a very fitting conclusion. I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was heartwarming and gripping at the same time. Don't you think it was? Something we couldn't stop
Absolutely.
watching at any point.
Absolutely. Like again, we were almost in the place of a person to whom Lou Bookman is trying to sell something. Because it was just so compelling. It was so compelling, the entire thing. It was fantastic.
Yes, we were quite mesmerized. I feel like we just
Yeah.
saw it. I think we saw it twice, if I'm not mistaken, and each time it was fresh.
Exactly. Each time it had something interesting to offer. Each time it had something so fascinating going on, something we might have missed earlier, and it just kept our attention completely.
Like we said at the beginning, even though this episode rates very low on the spookometer for us, it's still an amazing episode. It's done
Absolutely.
something. It's done so many things right without being scary. I think it's something of a masterpiece. I absolutely loved it.
Absolutely, yeah. And it goes to show that you don't need to be, don't need to have a lot of horrific things happening to
Yes,
tell a good story. There doesn't
absolutely.
need to be a lot of shock value or a lot of horror things or scary real ghosts and all. It's just a great story with some supernatural elements, something eerie, something unsettling, but at the
Yes.
same time, so very heartwarming.
A very heartwarming and touching tale. How these characters shine through the entire story, that really stood out for me.
Yeah.
So,
Both the episodes that we've talked about so far, they are both very character centric. The
they
story is
are.
there, but the actors really take the credit
They-
for how well they've done.
they
They have
do.
complemented the story and the direction. Everything has just come together so well.
Yes, Lou Bookman is one of those characters that really sticks out in your mind because he's something like a fairy tale character, a peddler who lost everything and then gains everything. And that was amazing to watch what he's doing. It was a very unique experience to watch him and to sit through his sales pitches. So let's come to the last part of our podcast, Medhavi. What would you do in a similar situation if you were faced with a very dashing, dapper, well-spoken man in a suit who keeps
Oh.
teleporting from here, this part of the room to that part of the room?
Like I said, I would say take me along, man. He was just too charming. How about you?
I think I would maybe give him some tea and say, now what can I do for you? Just,
Yeah. What would you like?
what would you like? Maybe get him to engage in conversation because he speaks so well. And then, yeah, gone, man, totally gone.
Yeah. And one thing that I'm sure we wouldn't do is to try to trick that guy
Oh
because
my goodness.
but I love how everything just comes together in the end. As in, what was supposed to happen, quote unquote, like what was fated to happen.
Oh,
Lou
yeah.
Bookman was to die at midnight.
Huh.
That did happen.
That did happen. That did happen. You can't trick fate or change the threads of fate because this is what is destined. And he had to face the music eventually and go. So, yeah, that was a lot of fun to talk about, Medhavi. It was extremely interesting, and we had so many insights on this episode.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I had so much fun watching it, talking about it. And
Oh, yes.
I really hope that our viewers who watch the episode now, they also enjoy it as much as we did because it is really something of a masterpiece.
Absolutely. You must definitely watch it. I think you would like it a lot. And on that note, I guess we'll wrap up this episode. And thanks a lot, Medhavi, we'll catch up in the next episode.
See you all then.